Hey everyone, I normally do, I guess, episodes around Samoan grammar. This is not one of those. I'm not really qualified to even have this topic up here, but it's something I think is interesting. So I thought I'd share it just in case anyone else is curious about the topic. But really, I wanted to talk about the word Palagi in Samoan. So I think I call this whatever Palagi speaking Samoan or something like that in the title. Anyway, so it's an interesting word. I always thought it was interesting because I'm considered a Palagi in Samoan, so I thought I'd do a quick little video on that and sort of my thought of where it came from. So I say lesson topics, but this isn't really a lesson. This is just sort of me ranting, but wanted to kind of talk about what does Palagi mean, and then where did it come from, or at least the theories that I think are interesting. So in terms of what does Palagi mean, Palagi basically means it's a Samoan word for foreigner, particularly a foreigner of European descent. So white guy or white girl. And it can also be used as an adjective to sort of describe things that are generally of Western culture. So, if something was sort of imported or came from sort of the West, you might see Palangi sort of used to describe that thing. So a couple of examples would be Iumitele Palangi Lali. And that really translates to that Palangi over there, that white guy over there is really tall. Or it might be something to describe like something that's not indigenous that came allegedly, maybe from Western traders or something like that. Or fa'i pa'alangi. Fa'i pa'alangi is basically, it means like pa'alangi bananas. And in my experience, this is used to describe some non-indigenous bananas that were imported into Samoa. Another one would be the term fa'apalangi. Fa'apalangi can mean English as a language, but it literally translates to the Western way. So Western way of speaking, Western, which includes language or of doing things, sort of again that Western sort of European culture. So I was super curious, in terms of where did this word come from? So it's interesting. There's definitely a Samoan word for white, and it's pai, and it's not parangi. So I was kind of curious, and there's words for pale, and this isn't really it. So I was always curious, like, where did this palangi word come from? I don't even, it doesn't sound like an English word, so it didn't sound like a transliteration. So if you break, Samoan is actually a modular kind of language, and so you can kind of break words apart oftentimes and kind of figure out where they came up with it. And so when you do that with palangi, it's kind of interesting. Pa means explode or burst, and langi means heaven or sky. And so there were people that had theorized that maybe this is describing sort of those European, old school sailing ships, and their white, sails or masts were seeming to burst from the horizon as they sort of came over the horizon, and you could kind of see them from the shore. Some people thought this is maybe kind of the Captain Cook sort of thing, where the Hawaiians sort of thought Captain Cook was somehow, a god of some kind, and so maybe this is someone, Pa from the Langi, kind of coming from heaven somehow. And I honestly had no idea, but it's really consistent across at least Western Polynesia. It's not necessarily consistent across Eastern Polynesia, but for example, in Tongan, the word for Westerner is Palangi. In Fijian, I don't speak any Fijian, but from what I understand, it's Papalangi or Vavalangi. And so that's kind of interesting. So it's very consistent across Polynesia. And then it was really weird because I remember, and I heard this word all the time when I lived in Samoa. Little kids coming out of school, pointing at me, hey, palangi, palangi, palangi. So definitely it's something that's stuck in my brain. And it's funny, my wife and I were in Cambodia, and it was a great experience. But it's interesting, we were kind of in this village, and school had just gotten out, and all these, and I stick out in places like this. And so these school kids came out and they started pointing at me, and they were saying barang, barang, barang. And I just had this flashback. I'm like, oh my gosh, this sounds so familiar to me. And my brain couldn't let hold of it because I was like, man, it sounds so close to what I remember hearing, when I was serving as a missionary in Samoa, and little kids being parangi, parangi, parangi. So I totally got, deep into the internet on this sort of thing. I started looking into it. And it turns out that, barang is the Cambodian or Khmer word for a a Westerner, someone of European descent. And I was interested in terms of where did that come from. And so from what I read, it came from the Thai word farang, and there just isn't an F in Khmer or in Cambodian, and so the F turned into a B. And in Thai, I was like, well, where did the Thai language get this word farang for Western or a white person? And what I understood was that actually came from like a Persian sort of Arabic word of farangi, which came from sort of the Muslim traders back in the times of the Crusades. And so I guess, in the Crusades, obviously, the Muslims had a lot of interaction with these Europeans, particularly the Franks, I guess, is where it came from, because they were on these sort of endless sort of crusades in the Holy Land. And so their word for describing them was farangi, coming kind of as Frank. Those were like sort of the I guess the group that sort of later became French and German peoples. And so I thought that was super interesting. And so in my mind, I'm like, all these words are the same. And like, there's actually a similar cognate in like Malaysian and other things. But what I thought was so cool is like, I don't know, to me, this sort of seems like there was a lot of, contact between Polynesia and, Southeast Asia, certainly, well before Europeans came. And it seems like the way that a lot of these different people sort of came into contact or understanding of sort of Europeans was probably through these, originally at least through these Muslim traders. And so that's how that word carried on throughout. And so when different explorers, European explorers at least, sort of discovered these different Polynesian islands, they already had a word for these white guys, and it was Palangi. And it all came back to, that Farangi word that, eventually kind of got passed along, whether in Thailand or Cambodia or maybe it's elsewhere. So I'm sure that there's similar words in other places, but that kind of blew my mind because I guess I had this sort of thought that, of course, Polynesians sort of were seafarers and they had sort of populated all these islands across the Pacific. But I think I discounted just how much probably interaction there really was between all those people, well before Europeans came. It's not like they just sort of forgot to have trade and intercourse through all those years. But to me, I kind of felt like this totally answers my question as to where this word came from. Anyway, again, not a grammar lesson, just something I dorked out on. I don't know. I thought it was kind of interesting. Let me know if you have any comments or if you have a different theory or if you've heard a different story. I'd be interested to hear it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.